CEO, founder of Locamoda, pal of mine. Take it away.
Hi everybody. I was going to have a presentation with some stuff about my background. I thought, as I'm really all about interaction, I would wing it and talk a bit about what I think would be interesting, but if it isn't interesting, I'll read that from your attention on your Android email or whatever and change what I'm going to say.
Tweets.
So most recently I've been I'm CEO of Locamoda, a local company, and what we do is really connect multiple screens. We have screens as large as jumbotrons in Times Square and as small as touch screens on jukeboxes in thousands and thousands of bars. About 15,000 screens all in all. And these screens are collectively in an industry called digital out of home. And the interesting thing about these screens and mobile is that the industry that we're in is predicted by me, but now a number of other people, to be part of the web. So we actually have a blog called The Web Outside, and I believe all screens in some way or other are going to be connected. So not just these screens out of home, you'll probably start noticing them, in cafes. It's not just billboards out of home, but any of you here been to Toscanini's in Cambridge? A great cafe and ice cream.
They never leave campus, these guys.
No, when you grow up and leave home, then there's a great cafe near MIT, and it was one of the first places we put a screen up. We also had a screen in the same owner's cafe in Somerville when we first started Locamoda. We just experimented. We put a screen up. We said, what would happen if we allowed people to text a message to the screen? And if I backtrack slightly, I came over here just after 9/11, and I had this idea that I wonder if there was a screen in Ground Zero where people could post their thoughts in real time, whether that would be interesting, and specifically if people all over the world could see those thoughts, so that you're motivated by the location to say something, and you're motivated, if you're not at the location, to see those discussions. And there's a little bit of an abstract thought, but it was inspired by 9/11, and we stuck this screen up in a cafe called the Sunday Cafe in Somerville, and then latterly at Toscanini's in Cambridge. And what we found is that people start using the screen in a very interesting way. They may flirt on the screen, and it's an obvious opportunity to say, hey, girl in a green dress, you're cute. But they also might say, the ice cream here is great. They may also say things that you don't want to say, like the ice cream here sucks. So we immediately started to understand this connection between the mobile screen and this screen in a location, and try to wrestle with, first of all, why were we doing this? We wanted to sort of help people have a richer communication, but also have some fun around the location. And we also suspected that the world we're moving into was not going to be like Minority Report. Has everybody here seen Minority Report? A few people? So the future in Minority Report is often linked to the world that I'm describing, but it's actually 180 degrees different. In Minority Report, Tom Cruise walks through a shopping mall in one scene, and all the screens change because they recognize him, and they start showing adverts that will be relevant to him. And a lot of people believe that this is the world we're moving into, and I believe it isn't the world we're moving into, for lots of reasons. First of all, there's a law to do with spam. You can't just send a message to somebody without them specifically opting in. The user experience would be terrible if you were walking in a shopping mall and the screen suddenly said, do you want to go back to that motel you were in last week? That could be a really embarrassing commercial. And as soon as that happens once, that whole concept is killed. And that's a vision, pretty entertaining vision, but it's a vision based on a pull structure where a message a push, where a message is pushed to a consumer. I believe that the world we're moving into is predominantly pull, where the consumer says, I'm interested in this, and if they don't, then you basically can't reach the consumer. So hopefully some of what I'm saying will resonate with what you're doing on Android apps. But we were experimenting with this idea of having the opportunity for the consumer to reveal themselves and send a message. In other words, that screen, if you made the screen compelling enough, would create this sort of pull environment. If we fast forward where we are today, when we started, there wasn't Twitter. Peter will remember early coffees where I would say, I think text messaging really is a worldwide thing, and Peter would say, I don't really see it catching on in the US. And obviously, I was right for once on that one. But now we have Twitter and we have applications like Foursquare. And when you put Foursquare on a venue's screen, we get between 30 and 60% more check-ins. Because people are reminded that, oh, if I do this, I might become the mayor. Or if I do this, I might get a second coffee free. So that's another hint that there's a relationship between a screen that's otherwise passive and a screen in your pocket that can be active. Also, we use Twitter now in a way that solved a problem we had when we first were talking to Peter. He said, well, are enough people going to text message? And we had this problem called Ghost Town. So there may be a few people in a bar that send a message and flirt, but after the excitement of that drops, then you've got these old messages that are hanging around for maybe days. So how do you stop that? Because you don't want to crash a party that's empty. You don't want to sort of burst through the door and find out that there's 3 people that have been there for 4 hours and nothing's going on. You really want to be part of a party that's really exciting and happening in real time. So we would connect all of the screens that we were working with and take all the messages from all the screens and display them in an intelligent way so that you'd have Stephen in Cambridge said this, and if I'm saying something about the Red Sox and I display the same message on a screen in New York, you immediately get a reaction from the screen in New York, and then that can come back to the screen in Cambridge. So we started to understand in a very literal way the impact of, I've forgotten the law, you guys should know, what's not Moore's law, but the law about network effect.
6 people, what's her name?
Anyway, the square of the number of users is the value of a network. So by connecting, sorry? Metcalfe, thank you. You shall go to the top of the class.
Thank you.
So Metcalfe's law was literally what we were experiencing. When you connect these screens in an intelligent way, you can display messages and filter messages, and do the right thing, you actually get a more valuable network. So if you have a screen on its own, with a few people that can interact with it, it may be interesting, but it's not that valuable. If you have 10 screens and lots of people are interacting, 10 people sending a message to each screen, you actually have 100 messages that you can send. Now, if you've got all these messages floating around, and the phone itself is revealing sort of clicks in these venues, the venues start to look a little bit like websites. You can say this cafe has 10 clicks, and these are the times, these are the area codes, this is the profile of the users in this cafe. And once you have that, then advertisers can get to a screen that doesn't need your permission. It might say, I'm interested in reaching students in the Waltham area that are in a cafe, and we have control of several thousand screens. We could say, okay, we could put this message on that screen, and that's a more tolerable thing than putting that message on a phone, which you might find, phone is my screen, it's private, I don't want you to blast me with spam. Right. So we're currently doing this in cafes. We enable a network called the New York Times Today network. We enable screens in bars, not only big plasma and LCD screens, but also jukebox screens. I've mentioned screens in Times Square, also similar screens in Las Vegas. We're also in some QSR restaurants, so sort of anywhere where there's screens, where the venue wants to engage consumers, so either reduce perceived wait times, so while they're making a coffee, you're looking at the screen and you see maybe highly local tweets, tweets about the Red Sox, tweets about the Bruins, tweets about the weather, but you feel like, well, these are my people talking. It's not just a ticker with something from Fox or CNN that you kind of feel it's a bit commoditized. So we do that, and we also display Foursquare messages and a number of other pretty interesting things. And one of the things I'm most excited about is an application that resembles a cork board, a community board. So if you go to Starbucks today, or many places, you'll see a cork board there, and there could be a flyer, that's been stuck there by a local band. There could be a message that says, we're going to be closed on Sunday. There could be another message that says, piano for sale, or apartment for rent. We're making a digital version of that. And each of those messages can be sent via Twitter, via text message, via an email, could be an RSS feed. So imagine Starbucks as an example, saying to their customers, if you're a band and you want to put a flyer on our digital corkboard, you can do that. Maybe they'll charge for it, maybe it'll be for free. But that's a great community application where if you're a band, you think, okay, I want to put my flyer up in all the local cafes around Cambridge because we're playing at the Middle East next Saturday. That's a really cool application. And I believe more and more the notion of what you might do online to promote yourself is going to go onto all these other screens. So working from what we're doing today all the way back to, I'm going to talk more about Symbian and my experience there. The common theme here is that I try to think about mobility as a behavior before it's a technology. How is the mobile consumer going to consume an application, a product, a service? Because if you think about mobility as a behavior first, you might realize that some applications really don't have the utility and the enchantment that you might otherwise think that when you're coding away, this is a really cool app. Well, is there a reason for me to use this app on a mobile device? Now clearly, I might be using a mobile device while I'm sitting there watching TV, but if I'm mobile, I actually have to stop and do a number of things. And unless I'm waiting for a bus or just trying to relieve some boredom, the utility of an application, something I'm going to use every single day, really requires me to get in really quickly, do something very, very, in a tiny amount of clicks, and typically less than sort of 3 or 4 clicks to do something. Otherwise, it's just too much effort. So I try to think about stuff like that. In my background, I mentioned that I came over here just after 9/11. I was able to do that because my wife is American. Very inspired to be on this side of the pond because I've always been in technology, and I think that to be in a market where you have a huge potential audience for your applications, it's a great opportunity. And I also passionately believed that mobile that I was experiencing in Europe and Asia wasn't unique. It was going to come to America. Now, the interesting thing was that when I first started talking to people over here about the value of a smartphone and about text messaging and all sorts of applications, the response I had, and this was sort of in the late 90s, was that that wasn't relevant for America. The infrastructure here was less standardized. The business model was different. So, in Europe and Asia, if you make the call, you pay for the call. The receiving party doesn't pay for the call. And that really impacts a lot of business models. And because the internet happened here in such a massive way, and a lot of Europe it didn't. So, and a lot of Europe is the phone was the first experience of being able to be digital, and certainly the same was true in Asia. The experience of the mobile phone in Europe and Asia was, from an American perspective, more less relevant to these technologies taking off. Now, I was a founder of Symbian. The background of Symbian was that it came out of a British company that was called Scion. Have any of you heard of Scion? The Scion, in its day, was the world leader in handheld computers. And the Scion Series 3 is a beautiful device and was hugely successful. And its 2 competitors were Hewlett-Packard and Sharp. And between the 3 of them, they had they were selling about 1 million devices a year. So it wasn't a big market, but it was a very niche, passionate market. And lots of people, it was sort of the equivalent in its day of the smartphone market. Lots of people would carry these in their breast pocket and open them up. They had a little keyboard and they could do spreadsheets and Word documents, but they weren't connected. And Scion was a world player in this market, an innovator. And I was involved in pen-based computing and had sold a company called Eden Group to GeoWorks, which is an American company. The first meeting I had after selling Eden Group was with the founder of Cylon, a guy called David Potter. And I said to David Potter, my vision of the future for handheld computing is that there will all be phones. That this disconnected device has a very short future. And you should do what pretty much every company in your position has failed to do. Apple failed to do it, Palm failed to do it, Sharp hadn't done it, and that is license your software. License your software so that it's inside every phone instead of trying to be the hardware that ultimately somebody will compete and you'll be out. So I was proposing that Cylon cannibalize themselves before they were cannibalized by Apple or Nokia or something else. And to his credit, David Potter said, intellectually I think that this is the right strategy, but I'm not sure that we know enough about doing it or that we have the stomach to do it. We're very successful right now, we're making millions of dollars. We're a public company, why should we cannibalize ourselves at the height of our success? He said, if you can convince my board to do this, then you have my vote, but I want my board to vote for it. So I spent about a month working with them, and we had the board meeting, and I proposed this structure for them to go into the phone business and license their software, and it got rejected. And it got rejected for interesting reasons. The politics of, if I'm telling you we're going to restructure your company and the 600 people that you're now responsible for, you're only going to be responsible for 5 or for 10 or for 50, and that the software isn't going to be yours anymore, we're going to license it to your competitors. That's a pretty difficult thing for you to say, okay, I willingly allow myself to be cannibalized. I worked with that team for another month to address their concerns. The hardware company that was making these handheld computers would have the ability not only to license the software that they already used, but they could license their software from Microsoft if they wanted. They were free to go wherever they want. The software company was free to license to anybody, and that meant that these independent companies that were going to be formed were going to be more agile, more competitive, and ultimately it was for the greater good. It would release value that wasn't currently released in the company. The second time I presented to the board, it got voted in, and they asked me to head up the software company, which I really was very excited about, pretty nerve-wracking as well. So we started with 60 engineers. We started licensing. Now, this is a culture, by the way, that had done everything themselves. We used to describe it as management by heroes. Something was wrong in the factory, one of the executives would rush in with a soldering iron to fix it because no one else could do it. And you just can't scale a business that way. You have to somehow break the culture and remold it, which is a real challenge. It's very, very difficult. So we became Cylon Software, and the other two companies were Cylon Computers and Cylon Industrial. And we needed to license to a company that wasn't Cylon just to understand what it's like to deal with an external company. Because you can't, if you're all in one company and the software is going to be late, you just say, sorry Fred, the software is going to be late. They go, oh, damn you. Okay. But if it's a company that's outside, you say, sorry, the software is going to be late. They say, well, you'll be hearing from my lawyers. We've got 100,000 phones on a factory line. The software isn't going to be late. It's going to be on time. You better do something about it. So we needed to get into that DNA. And we initially licensed to Philips, who had this concept for a smartphone. And it's a horrible concept, but they were the client, and we developed it, and the product came out and failed. The whole process, though, for us was fascinating, because we sort of grew up doing that one product. And the next product that we managed to find a licensee for was Nokia. And ironically, they were using, does anybody remember the Nokia communicator?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're now coming into you're born by now. So Nokia communicator, the first generation, was using an operating system by GeoWorks. And GeoWorks happened to be, coincidentally, the company that I sold my previous company to. So Nokia said, we're going to license Cylon's operating system for the next generation of the communicator. But we can't tell anybody. Because if we tell people, they'll stop buying the current communicator, and we can't afford to have the product stored in the marketplace. So for about 18 months, we worked with the biggest company in the world. They had over 30%, 33% of the world market. And we knew that we had their flagship product. We couldn't tell anybody. Meanwhile, Microsoft were gearing up with Windows, it may have been Windows CE or Windows, it was previously Windows for Pen Computing, they rebranded it, I think, Windows CE. So they said, the world thought if Windows is coming out with a product for mobile phones, then that's it. That's going to be the standard. And we knew, and this is one of my themes for today, is to maybe question the prevailing wisdom in the marketplace. We knew that just because Microsoft had the dominant platform on the desk, it didn't necessarily make sense for them to have a dominant platform in mobile phones. And the reason for that is that Nokia, but not only them, Ericsson and Motorola, and pretty much every other handheld manufacturer, prized the user interface as the thing that gives the stickiness between the user and them. The last thing in the world they would willingly do is give away the stickiness of their device. So if every phone had the same interface and it belonged to Microsoft, they may as well give their business to Microsoft. So it's interesting what's happened in the last 6 months. But certainly this is in the late 1990s. And so we knew there was no way that Microsoft could be a viable operating system for the future of phones in the way that they had done for the desk. Also, everybody knew how that played out. They didn't want it to play out in the phone space. And yet the prevailing wisdom, I was coming over to the US to try and find new licensees. And remember, people didn't know that we were already working with the world's largest because that was confidential. And they were saying, why should we license from you? Microsoft is going to own this space. And I would try and say, look, here's the reason why they won't. No. This is America, Microsoft's American. What you're doing over there is irrelevant. Anyway, it's easy today to look back at that and laugh, but it really was a tough pitch. So, the interesting thing is, what happened then at Scion is the management at Scion, if you remember there were these three groups, Scion Software, Scion Computer, Scion Industrial. Scion themselves got pretty spooked and they said, we are not confident that we can win this race. Even though you're working with the world's largest, the prevailing wisdom is that Microsoft's coming to town. And there was a meeting of all of the group CEOs, which I was invited to, and as the CEO of Scion Software. And I was told by the chairman of the company, who was sort of waving in a sort of Chamberlain way, a ticket to Seattle. Said, this is a ticket to Microsoft. And Stephen, you need to know that when a steamroller is coming, you get out the effing way. And I was like, what? Yep, we're going to sign with Microsoft. You fool, no one's signing with Microsoft. How can you believe the fear, uncertainty, and doubt? So I went to David afterwards and said, this doesn't make sense, and the value that we're building this company is going to be completely trashed. I think we can at least sell this to Nokia. Give me 30 days, give me 60, give me as much time as you want. He instructed me, and there's a blog called The Register, where this story is set out from a number of different perspectives. He instructed me to have a budget to get rid of everybody, and anybody that didn't want to go over to the dark side was out. And we called that budget the Dark Star budget. But he also said, if you think that you can sell this to Nokia, then you've got 30 days. And how much do you think you can get for it? And I said, if you've effectively written it off, then I don't know, but I think it's certainly going to be worth something to them because they're building their next generation of phones on this operating system. So we went to Nokia and we said, look, there's an opportunity here to come out of Scion. And the opportunity would be to create a new standard, because if you, Nokia, can't beat the standard because you'll polarize the industry. If you're the standard, then Ericsson and Motorola will say you're not the standard. Probably you'll force them to go to Microsoft. So there was a moment in time where, even though it was pretty bad, as an entrepreneur it was a fantastic opportunity. I had nothing to lose. And the opportunity with Nokia was to say, we can get this. What do we need for this to be a standard? And what we needed was to work with our competitors. So if Nokia said the standard is Nokia, then all their competitors would say no. What if Nokia could go to Ericsson and say, Ericsson, Nokia and Scion collectively are going to give this software at $5 and $10, depending on the type of phone that you want to make, as opposed to $35, which is what Microsoft were charging. And Ericsson, Nokia, Scion agreed that we would do this. And there were all sorts of side deals from history. It's kind of interesting. Ericsson said, we will do this as long as an application we've got is put into the pie, is put into this standard. And we said, well, what is this application? It's called Bluetooth. So we were the first people to hear about Bluetooth outside of Ericsson. Does anybody know where the name Bluetooth comes from?
No.
Pirate. Close. It was a king, it was the nickname of a king of Sweden. So they just called it Bluetooth. It was an internal name. And they should know that. So all sorts of horse trading, and the most interesting and the most political thing was that we needed Motorola, but we said we can't get them involved in these discussions right now because to get three massive competitors around the table was too much. The day before we announced this, and remember that Scion's a public company, so we had to announce it on the stock market. The day before we announce it, we will go to Motorola and say, here is the contract, everybody's equal, you can put your name here, and we will all be arm in arm on the day, and if you don't want to put your name there, we will understand. So we went to Motorola literally the day before we could announce it. They hated the idea that they had been forced effectively to do this, but they agreed. So on the day of the announcement, it's Motorola, Ericsson, Nokia, Scion announce a standard. I mean, collectively we had 85% of the world market overnight. Scion shares rocketed about 25% in one day. I got hauled up to Brussels to the anti-competitive lobby because I had to explain why it wasn't unfair to Microsoft, that this could be a strategy that would hurt Microsoft. I had to explain that, well, actually, if Microsoft made better or cheaper software, they could easily compete, and most joint ventures don't survive. So they allowed us to be a company. We started off with 600 engineers. We built the team to 600 engineers at that stage, and a really, really exciting time. And we started licensing primarily to our shareholders, to Ericsson, Nokia, and Motorola, and within a couple of years, Samsung, Panasonic, and some others joined Symbian. Of course, very recently, since iPhone, and I've been out of the company a long time by then, Symbian has been fully acquired by Nokia and then completely let go of, and Nokia have gone over to Microsoft, which is, I think, pretty sad. But the reason I'm saying this, I think it's kind of interesting, some of the history behind these operating systems, but I also tend to think that behind the scenes there's interesting stuff going on that at a developer level, at a startup level, we don't always think about. I was shown something quite a few years ago called the Shell scenario planning strategies. And what they are scenarios that are designed by really bright people. They sort of get together once or twice a decade, and they work through economic and technology and all sorts of other trends. Maybe they get together more frequently than that. But they put together these scenarios, and you're supposed to then plan your strategy based on what if we're in a scenario A or a scenario B. Because so many of us come up with a great idea, and it's in the vacuum of what's actually going on, not only in our industry, but in the whole world. And we don't have the luxury to say, well, I'm going to launch this fantastic application, but what if there's a war, or what if there's a this? If you actually look at some of these papers, you get a slightly different perspective that may inspire you that the application you're writing will be really powerful if we're going into that kind of world, but maybe completely irrelevant if we're going into this kind of world. And maybe that will make your application, have a few more hooks so that you can be more nimble if you are suddenly in a different world. So the world that we were in, on the surface, it was Microsoft's going to dominate, but underneath it, strategically, we knew that there was less desire for this sort of control. that we were going into a more sort of collaborative, more of a community kind of opportunity. The word symbiont, symbiosis, was supposed to represent and resonate with people about this sort of collective, as opposed to sort of Bill Gates kind of empire. And it reminds me today, even though the way that's played out has had an interesting twist very recently, I personally am not a believer that the Windows platform in phones is ever going to be successful. Now, I might be wrong, because Nokia is still formidable, and on their own they can sell a lot of phones. But I'm not sure as developers, maybe you can tell me, as developers, how many developers are going to place their bet on Windows as opposed to Apple or Android? Are you going to split it evenly or ignore Windows? Is anybody here developing anything for Windows?
Well, no, I'm not developing for Windows. The thing is, like, I grew up abroad as well, and when I came here, I realized Nokia doesn't really have a market share in this country.
Yeah.
So asking anybody this question over here isn't exactly a fair question.
It depends if you might turn that on its head and say the opportunity as a developer is to develop something for markets outside of America where Nokia is probably starving for applications. There are definitely opportunities. Could you be the Angry Birds on Windows 7, or could you be TweetDeck on Windows 7? There's definitely going to be opportunities if you look at the potential of that phone in other markets where it's huge, as opposed to being very, very just thinking about your immediate. Now, I still am not optimistic about it, but I do think that there are opportunities as a developer to say, okay, we're going to deliberately put our flag in the ground of Windows, because everybody else is going to be on Android, everybody else is going to be on iPhone. But that's the least, that's a strategy, and I think that as entrepreneurs and developers, we should think more strategically than tactically. And whatever you're thinking of, there's at least 1,000 people thinking exactly the same way. So how many games and how many utilities are there going to be in the marketplace that you're going into, and how are you going to be discovered? How are you going to differentiate yourself? So maybe a way of differentiating yourself is to be on a different platform. But I think under the surface, you can get a different perspective on mobile. I think the way of doing that is to think about mobility as a behaviour, so that you are really, it depends if you want to build a utility or something more entertaining, but think very seriously about the environment that the people are using this application in, and make it simple enough and accessible enough for people to use, and you might have a hit on your hands and actually less work, maybe develop less features. So is this something that people are going to use while they're walking, or while they're standing in a line shopping, and try and think about the actual mobility of the person as opposed to just the technology. And also, I've mentioned the relationship between the phone and the screens in cafes and bars, etc. But the relationship between the phone and any screen. So we know that we know that people are watching TV with a phone. So they can be participating in an otherwise passive screen, with maybe responding to tweets or answering questions or posting comments or playing games. And we've done some of that on some channels, and it is popular in some other countries. So I think that you're going to see applications where these multi-screen experiences are pretty interesting and valuable. So there's a question of that.
Why would you want, as a developer, just to limit yourself to one of these operating systems or like service providers?
You probably wouldn't, but I guess you're going to start somewhere. You're going to have your center of gravity somewhere.
True, but once you have that going, if every developer doesn't want to limit himself to just one platform, if he wants to publish on all, don't they have a collective bargaining power for standards, for example? Whereas once the standards become the same for all the systems, that you end up with just one.
It's not impossible. I think that's a long shot, though, because the developer, if you look at who can dictate a standard, if you've got thousands of developers, it's going to be pretty difficult to get that motivation aligned. And it's also pretty difficult if you've got a UI layer that has to understand multiple operating systems and multiple hardware variants and multiple screen. You know, it gets fragmented pretty quickly. I mean, in the many years ago, the original concept of Java was write once and run anywhere. And I don't think, I might be wrong, but I'm not sure there's yet an application that you can write once and it runs everywhere. Just because hardware is differentiating itself by having, you know, this one's got a camera, this one has a side button, this one has a touch screen, this one has a keyboard. So, you know, you write it 100 times and it might run on 100 devices. So it's pretty difficult. And you know, standards are pretty difficult to you know, they're very political as well. So I'm not sure.
I'm just wondering, like, if there is a trend for expansion and retraction of these features that, I mean, eventually the features you're looking at for hardware, for software providing the APIs and such, will be, I guess, pretty much agreed upon.
Well, so interesting that you say that. At the formation of Symbian, we had a strategy to do exactly that, and we called it DFRDs, which stood for Device Family Reference Designs. And we said we thought there were room for 4 device families. A family that is sort of, you know, has a keyboard, a family that's a touch screen, a family that's got a small screen, a family that's got a big screen. I forget all their names, but you know, one was more tablety. And they were given names to do with colours. So quartz was quarter VGA, and then we had pearl, and we had a few others, crystal. All of the DFRDs were choked. That's actually an Ericsson ringtone. It used to come from an Ericsson device.
That sounds great.
I ported it to my iPhone. So the DFRDs weren't allowed to survive because our licensees wanted to own the user experiences. They didn't want to be told by the software, you can't have a button or you can't have a keyboard if you use this device, it has to be this way. Because then the ownership, much like the argument with Microsoft, the ownership wouldn't be with them, it would be with the operating system. And even though they were shareholders in the operating system, they didn't want the ownership of their user experience to be outside of their own control.
Then you said now the past couple of months have been interesting because that's different from that time where the ownership was,
Yeah.
the manufacturers wanted to retain the ownership. Now you've got Samsung, Android phone, and Motorola, and,
Yeah.
and all of that. So isn't
But still the hardware guys still want to put their layer on top of it, otherwise they get commoditized. The carriers want to put their layer on top, otherwise they feel they're just bit pipes. And it's really, really difficult to convince them, even though it's obvious as a consumer, this is just getting in the way.
right?
You know, Samsung wants to put their little button on the side and their different camera, and they want to have a higher resolution camera because they know everybody else has got this resolution camera. Somebody else wants to put a keyboard on it, somebody else wants voice recognition. And it, you know, I mean, that's just, I can't see that ever not happening because, you know, unless you say, this isn't a world where it's like Microsoft saying to Dell, you know, we're going to give you some special treatment here on pricing, but basically it's the same as everybody else. And you know, there were only sort of Dell and HP and a few others ever made any money out of that. So the phone manufacturers don't want to go down the same way. There may be some less innovative companies that say we're just happy to get an Android vanilla application, but they're going to want to put their magic on top of it. And then you as a developer are going to say, if I want this to run on this really cool phone, first of all, you're placing a bet on that phone being a hit, but then you've got to do, you know, variants of your software maybe to take care of that. Maybe.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not, but you know, if it's got a high-res camera, or it's got voice recognition, you can think, okay, well, I want to have an interface to that.
Especially the manufacturers will want all the apps being made to easily be used on their devices, even though they have the sugar on top.
Yeah.
So they don't want that part to get in the way, essentially. So both, I should say, gain, like, it's a consideration for it.
Well, it's a Darwinian thing. So
Yeah.
when iPhone went to iPhone 4, you know, that you could still run, you know, previous generation apps on your phone, but they all look, you know, pretty bad. And so, you know, if you're Samsung and you've got a higher resolution screen, of course you're going to want to have all the old apps run on it, but you're also going to want some new apps that look fantastic on it, and it's going to make all the old ones, you know, it's still, you can still buy it, still run all the old apps, but they're not going to look very good. And you always have this stress in the marketplace. But you know, I don't think there's going to be a one flavour suits all.
I saw an ad, I think, on TV for, I think it was like a Sony Ericsson phone, and I think it was like a phone that had like a gaming kind of like controller, like built into it or something like that. And I'm wondering like how many developers are going to take a risk developing games like exclusively for that kind of phone, like I mean control scheme wise. Like,
So I think that's another point, that when we were doing the DFRDs, we thought sensibly, why don't we just say there are only 4 types of phones? And I think we came to the conclusion very, very quickly that there's an infinite number of phones, that there's going to be phones with keyboards and phones that are voice driven, and phones with all screens, and phones that have got game machine, you know, so those ideas have been tried. You know, Nokia had the Engage device, you know, years ago. It didn't do very well, but I think that there are going to be people that are really passionate about that. They're going to say, well, if Sony's going to get behind it, and I could be the killer app on that phone, it's an opportunity for me. So you know, you're making a bet. You know, it's not going to take the majority of the market, but if Sony comes to you and says, we want to make your application a flagship app on our phone, you're going to be pretty psyched about it, because if it is a hit, then you know, it's going to be pretty good. But you've got to decide: do you want to be one of 600,000 applications on some marketplace, or would you prefer to be one of 200 on a different platform?
When Scion made that deal with Nokia, Ericsson, and Motorola, did they each buy like a quarter of the shares of Scion?
Yeah, really good question. So it was spun out. It was a $100 million deal. So they each put in the equivalent of $25 million and some assets as well. And Scion had the benefit of taking most of that investment as a, you know, they said, if this is just a part of Scion and it's worth 100 million, then the whole of Scion is worth even more, and that's why their shares went up so high. So yeah, it was like a $100 million startup.
Nice.
Sorry.
Another question.
Sorry, another question.
I remember a few years ago, there were all these doom and gloom articles about the web being dead, and now it seems like everyone's talking about HTML5 is making applications obsolete. Is this just a pendular thing, or does no one know what they're talking about? What's your take on it?
Well, that's also another good question. So we're in a marketplace where we have to take a lot of notice of sort of the application, sort of dumbed down application layer. So we use Flash. Obviously, you know, we're dealing with, you know, as I said, screens in Times Square all the way down to jukeboxes, and most of those screens run Flash and they don't run HTML5. And it's sort of, I think that the leading edge, and you know, I've got enough war wounds by being at the bleeding edge a lot of the time, but the leading edge, I think HTML5 is here to stay, but it doesn't yet do some of the things that Flash and ActionScript can do in a sort of a container that you can be very happy and that it's safe. You know? But Flash is also not owned by, it is not an open standard, so I'm not sure that in 3 to 5 years' time, Flash is going to be around.
Which is a counterpoint to what I wanted to add, is that HTML is really the one flavor for all, even though Internet Explorer, Microsoft, and Netscape were battling it out for a long time to like make their own standards.
Yeah.
Before it still managed to stay very pure of sorts. And why can't that happen for a phone?
Well, I think bits of it can and will happen for a phone, but the phone also has a hardware stack that is very unique to the device and its environment, and it will put requirements on HTML5 or on any application layer that are unique to the phone. So if HTML5 is thinking about the web as well as, you know, thinking about all sorts of screens, the standard will move more slowly than an application layer and a hardware manufacturer can move. So if I come out with a GPS chipset and a better handwriting recognition and near-field communications and gyro and all of those things, as you all know, are all part of the modern handset and more. So if I'm Visa and I want to use my application to tap into near-field communication, and HTML5 doesn't even recognize it yet, or there's no protocol to do something with it, or not in the way that you want to use it because it's not quite at the bleeding edge, or it's not essential for some of the standard.
That's just a browser, basically, or the operating system of sorts, but HTML5 assumes that there is a device, whatever it is, with just its device tag. So,
but if you're saying a write once, run anywhere kind of application, I don't have enough knowledge to comment on whether if you wrote it purely in HTML5 and didn't understand how to get to the metal of or as close as possible to the metal of a handset, that you would be able to do it for all devices. I think that you would struggle.
So do you think it's a defensible plan to build a core application and then tweak it for some of the interesting extensions? Or is it better to focus on one particular class and not even have competition on other devices?
I think it depends what you're doing. I mean, if it's a game and you can do something quickly and get it to market and see that there's demand for it, you can then rewrite it.
Mm-hmm.
You can spend all your time trying to be clever and write objects that are much more portable and not have a successful application anyway. So my recommendation is always to get to market as quickly as possible and see what the reaction is, and then worry about making the architecture smarter. Because you're making a bet on your application and the handset and the market and the business model, and it's likely that more than one of those bets isn't 100% right. So you want to just be as nimble as possible, in my opinion. I don't know if anybody else. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go on it. The only, we were talking about lunch, the only question is how much can you learn before you actually write the app? And can you actually learn stuff? And that's kind of where we're sort of going back and forth. But the principle is exactly right. Do as little as you possibly can to get feedback from your people.
Yeah, for sure. That was a question.
What was your boss's reaction?
Which boss where?
When you went and you made this deal with all the other companies?
Oh, he was delighted. Well, there are lots of reactions. He could probably slap himself on the back as being really smart at sort of motivating his team to do a deal like this. There are all sorts of side stories. Pekka Alapitula was the CEO of Nokia at the time, and he picked up the action of speaking to Bill Gates the morning before we announced Symbian, because Bill Gates was trying to license Windows to everybody, and obviously up until then had thought that maybe that was going to be a likelihood. So Pekka Alapitula spoke to Bill Gates to tell him that actually we're not going to license Windows and we're going to create this company called Symbian and we're going to make a run at having our own standard. And he said it was the worst phone call of his professional career, that Gates lost his temper and started screaming at him. And
Wow.
it's pretty strange. But as far as David Potter was concerned, I mean, he called in Goldman Sachs to sort of verify that this was worth 100 million. Goldman Sachs didn't know anything about operating systems, so they asked us, what do we think it was worth? We said, we think it's worth 100 million. So they went back to Sion and said, we think it's worth 100 million. It wasn't quite like that, but they looked at all the other operating systems, and Metroworks and a few other companies were publicly traded. So they came to the same conclusion as us. And I think they picked up $1 million in fees from Sion for doing that. So it's a good job if you can get it. Yeah.
Initially you mentioned that the company was public, and that's why you had to make the announcement.
Mm-hmm.
But then you went on to say it was a $100 million startup.
It was a $100 million startup in terms of our DNA, because one of the happiest moments of my professional career was getting 600 people into a this room in the basement of a hotel, and telling them that today there's going to be an announcement. And we had to wait until we were given a green light. So in the next 5 minutes, there's going to be an announcement on the stock market that Scion have spun out Scion Software, and we are now a new company. We unveiled Symbian that no one knew anything. There was a team of 5 of us that were planning this. And here's the website. Here's what we're called. Here's how much money we've got to make this happen. We're going to be the standard. All the work we've been working on as developers over the past 3 years is going to be the future of the phone industry. And our owners now, not just Scion, but Nokia, Ericsson, Motorola, and everybody was like, oh my God, it was fantastic. There wasn't even a rumor about it. So that was, but it was still, we were a private company. We'd spun out of a public company, and that investment was to make it happen. Yes,
I heard a couple of days ago about Nokia going for some other operating system on their phone.
Windows 7. Well, they've committed to Windows 7, ironically.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so if you don't know the sort of postscript, about 6 months ago, Nokia replaced their CEO with a guy who used to work at Microsoft. And so the CEO of Nokia is an ex-Microsoft guy called Steve. Steve. Not Steve Ballmer. That would be too
There got a
terrible.
lot of Steves there.
Yeah. And the first deal he did was to bring in the Windows operating system.
Not
from-
Sinofsky.
It's like unbelievable. He actually wrote it's a pretty interesting thing to Google. He wrote a memo called burning oil rigs. It was supposed to motivate his team before this announcement that we're on this oil rig and it's burning down, and we have this option to sort of jump in the ocean, but we absolutely can't stay on the oil rig. And what he meant by that is we can't stay with Symbian, we can't stay with our own proprietary stuff. We have to jump in the ocean and risk going to something else. So everybody said, well, is it going to be Android? And if it was Android, I mean, imagine this decision wasn't easy, and he couldn't have come into Nokia and just said, hey, we're going to go with Microsoft. That must have been, a really thought out and pretty brave decision.
Stephen Elon.
Steve Elon. Thank you. So, I don't know, credit to him for doing the least predictable thing, but I think that no one that I can think of does a deal with Microsoft and come out ahead of Microsoft. Microsoft paid $1 billion for the right to be in every Nokia. But it's not good. It's tough though. What do you do?
So, one other weird reason why somebody might decide to want to build an app for Windows is that Microsoft probably is looking for marquee
Yes.
products, and likely you would get a lot more help from Microsoft in money, promotion, or visibility than you would ever get from Google or Apple.
For sure. They need you.
Huh? They need
They
you,
need you.
and they will act on that, and they will give
Yeah.
you special access and so on.
And actually, they're good with developers.
Yeah, they are.
And Nokia sell a boatload of phones. They may be dropping market share, but they still have around 30% of the world market. So I would give it serious thought, because there's a ton of people out there that will buy a phone because it's a sexy phone, not because it's Android or Apple. So it's pretty interesting.
Just one thing, you say they've got 30% of the world market, we also want to keep in mind Nokia's smartphones are a very small fraction of that.
But I do believe, and this has always been the case, that today's smartphone is tomorrow's ordinary phone. So, yeah, maybe by tomorrow they'll have 20% or 10%, but it's a big number. And we're very used to hearing about how many phones Android have shipped and how many phones Apple have shipped. It's still a tiny percentage of the billions of phones in the world. So if you had a chance, and they're smart people running Windows and Nokia, so I wouldn't make a bet right now. I'm not in that market, but I don't think it's a totally stupid thing to do. I think it's you would, for the reason Peter said, you'd be given more attention, and there's going to be a serious push. So if you were the killer application on all Windows 7 phones, you'd probably make a load more money than being one of hundreds of thousands on Android.
I know one of the things that Microsoft has done to promote developers is, or at least college students, they have a website called DreamSpark which
Mhm.
gives you access to all of their development software for free. And the other thing they just announced was Windows 8 is coming out
Mhm.
next year, and Windows 8 will run all of Windows Phone 7 applications.
Mm.
It'll have its own dashboard that'll run those applications along with Windows alongside. So
I
not
didn't
only
mean to put
will-
everybody off their Android applications, because I don't have anything to gain by everybody going to Windows, but
No, I think that the point is that choosing a platform is a very nuanced decision that has both technical and lots of strategic and market
yeah.
elements to it. And you have to go to one and have a reason why you picked it, or to pick it.
Yeah, and actually, it may be better to have a reason that's wrong than to just not think about it.
Just
because you
like
can
my
be-
iPhone, I'm gonna do for iPhone.
Well, I think if you had a reason and it's wrong, you can revisit that. You know, at least you're up to speed in terms of the strategic rationale for doing what you're doing. But if you're just caught out, you're suddenly on a platform that's dying, or you know, you're competing with 100 other applications that are like you, or 600,000 applications to be noticed. Then you may have spent a year developing something that's got little hope.
And the other point you make is critical, which is do the least amount of work you can before you get to market, because, for all those reasons.
Yes.
I know that like in the video game industry that certain companies like Sony, they want exclusive rights to that
Mhm.
game, like you only on this system, or Nintendo only on this system, to try to hook people into buying the operating system.
Mm-hmm.
So did they do that with smartphones? Like, say someone develops for Windows 7, could they like threaten to release it on iPhone or whatever they do?
I don't think commercially they would or can, because they almost, it's counterintuitive. When we license, so I've always been in licensing, so when we license, we never do exclusive deals. The reason for that is that if it's exclusive, it becomes proprietary, and proprietary ultimately doesn't win out. So, you know, you almost want to have a hit like TweetDeck. You know, when TweetDeck comes to Windows 7, if it's not already there, there's going to be enough people that may want to buy the Windows 7 because they used to use it on a competing platform. If Windows say we're going to stop you developing an application once you've developed Windows 7 on any other platform, then the developer isn't going to have the ability to have a hit on another platform. It's probably not going to be encouraged to do it. So it's sort of counterintuitive. But
Don't they pay money for that? Don't they give people?
They may, but you may be selling your future. Unless they make it so worth your while you never need to work again. It may be a very short-sighted decision. You know, sometimes a way around it, where there's enough face saving on both sides, is to say I will develop an exclusive flavor. So this has got some jewelry around it that's exclusive to your platform, but the underlying platform, the engine and everything that's sort of underneath the skin is non-exclusive. So you can sometimes have a story there where they get the exclusive Sony version, but you can still do something that's slightly different anywhere else. Yeah.
You started off your story telling the CEO what you should be doing. Why did he listen to you? What did you do before then?
That's a good point. You have to ask him that, but he personally made a lot of money out of this deal, and he had taken Scion from the early days of the Sinclair Spectrum all the way up to what it was. It was sort of a global leader in a very, very small market. So I think intellectually he believed that if his team got behind this, this was the next thing for the company to do. And so he almost let himself off the hook by saying, well, if all these smart people, if you can argue with them for long enough and they all agree with the strategy, then I'm going to support that, which I thought was a pretty good way to do it. He didn't railroad it in. He could have said, I'm the founder, I'm the CEO, chairman, this is our future, and just do it and have people kicking and fighting. He also saw that his market was unsustainable, and that whenever companies have tried to do this and failed, so Palm was one, and they stumbled at exactly this point and then really struggled after that. and there were quite a few examples of companies going into the computer industry that also failed to sort of embrace a standard and became proprietary. So I think that he intellectually got behind the decision and probably felt that if we brought it to the table at such a high price, he couldn't lose. He was personally going to make enough money that after that he didn't really care. He sort of cashed out and still had 80% of his company. So he couldn't really lose.
And then more like, what did you do in your life to get to the point where you were well respected enough to do that? Like, what's the story of your life before you were CEO of software?
You were 17.
I was a baby. Well,
Thank you, Boris.
humbly, I don't know. I am passionate about what I believe, and I said to David Potter, I'm not a consultant. If you want me to work here for a few months as a consultant and come up with something that you're going to agree with, then that's not me. That I'm going to tell you what I think you should do, and it's going to have some validity based on the strategic direction of the industry and the value of the company. But if you don't like it, I don't really care. This is what I think you should do. And I can only work that way. I kind of, I won't be rude, but I just cannot say something that somebody wants to hear if I don't believe in it. So I tend to do business with people that either say, okay, I trust you, this makes sense, or it's a breath of fresh air. But I have, as an entrepreneur, this is a recurring theme as well. I have to have 10 meetings to have one that goes well, because a lot of people do tend to have meetings with people, successful meetings with people that will tell them what they want to hear. So I just can't do that. So I might be more successful and respected even more if I just did that. So, I would say humbly, I'm not sure that I'm the person that you just asked about. I feel that I could work, I could be more respected and do more of these deals, but unfortunately it's really tough. Because I like to disrupt, I like to question the status quo. And most people don't want to rock the boat at all. They want to, especially if it's on, if things don't change during my career, why should I take a risk? So I end up, most of the things that I do, I find happen when companies are really threatened. Unless the company does something different, they're not going to survive. And then the advice I give, it's almost, that's the recipe to go forwards. If there's a company that doesn't have to do something different and I'm giving them that advice, then that's a much harder sell for me. But thank you for asking the question that way around. I hope, as Android developers, it's been a bit provocative or at least a bit interesting.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve.
Okay.